Hello, and thank you for choosing this Analyst Insight podcast from the Information Security Forum. My name is Mark Ward. I'm a Senior Research Analyst at the ISF, and in this podcast, we are talking about threats, how to recognize them, where your intelligence comes from, and what criminal and state-sponsored hackers might be tormenting us with next. Here to keep the discussion going are grizzled threat hunters, if they don't mind me calling that, Paul Watts and Lee Munson. Hello, Paul.
Good to see you again, Mark.
Thanks for coming along. And also here, Lee. Hello, Lee. Lee joins us after working for quite a few different security companies, handling threats on a day-to-day basis. Is it good to be away from that, Lee, or do you miss that digital combat, if that's what it was like?
Hello, Mark. I suppose in some ways it's good to be away from that. I've seen a lot of things that would perhaps frighten a few people, and it's good to get a completely different view of security now.
Yeah, you've definitely got the 1,000-yard stare of a grizzled combat veteran. And also here is Max Brook, who updated and expanded the ISF report into threat intelligence and how organizations can use that capability to handle some of the risks they face. Hello, Max.
Hello, Mark. Thank you for having me on this one.
That's all right. Yeah, I think you're a key part of all this. So this podcast is going to be released alongside the updated threat intelligence report. I think there's some of the work being done to socialise that amongst members and across the internet as well. So Max, if we can start with that, can you give us a quick summary? I know it's quite a lengthy report, just how threat intelligence has changed. Sort of what types of things were addressed in that updated report.
Sure, yeah. So I think the original report, which was released back in 2017, kind of had a view that threat intelligence at that time was very much oversold and kind of really underdelivered in what organizations were able to use it for and the value that they thought they were deriving from the capability. So our goal was to really reflect in the updated report the changes over the past 5 years and how threat intelligence has become much more grounded in the way organizations operate on a day-to-day basis and the way that they assess their threats. And as well, really, the journey that members have gone on in terms of understanding and really embedding the capability within different facets of their organization and trying to kind of, in a way, have a real value and purpose behind taking themselves on that journey.
All right. Okay. Paul, as a former CISO and perhaps a user of threat intelligence, does that sort of chime with your experience? Was it something that you felt you possibly needed, but then when you got it, you thought, yeah, maybe it's not doing what I need?
Yeah, to a greater extent, I'd agree with that. My experiences of using threat intelligence over the years is it's got to have a place, a sense of purpose. I think an organisation that brings threat intelligence in and doesn't really have the foundations to use that in an adequate way has really created a bit of a nuisance for themselves, if I'm honest with you. The problem with good, rich sources of threat intelligence data is you can't unsee it once you've seen it. So, it can be a bit burdensome if you're not prepared for it. And I've learned that lesson probably the hard way very early on. But things have moved on. The threat landscape is so dynamic and so prolific, and I'm sure Lee's got many examples of that. I don't think that it's something that you can ostensibly ignore, but you have to be ready for it.
Yeah, I was going to ask Lee, and 5 years isn't that long ago, but yeah, just in terms of the threats out there, obviously there's state-sponsored actors and there's APT groups, those kinds of things. But is it, as far as you're concerned, Lee, are those changes significant, or is it same things but just slightly higher tempo?
I would say that it is significant, perhaps not more serious. It's more about evolution. So the big two trends I've noticed are how ransomware groups have gone from purely encrypting data and asking for money in return for decrypting it to exfiltrating data and actually holding that data itself to ransom. That's a big change. And also, probably more topically, you see some nation state actors moving away from being crimeware gangs to perhaps working with their states. That's quite an interesting move.
Yeah, so more serious all the way around. But I just, ask a basic question, I guess to Max, as the author of that report. When we talk about threats here, are we talking the whole spectrum of them, or is it generally those bigger, nastier ones, the APT, the state-sponsored, those kind of things, all the ransomware groups and that, or is it no matter what organisation you are, the threats you need a just better understanding? Given Paul's comments about what you're going to do with that information, you just need a better understanding of all the things that are ranged against you.
Yeah, I think it's definitely the latter there. There's obviously the headliners that you have in terms of the nation states and those big ticket threats that organizations around the world will face. But the reality is, and we try to make this clear in the report and the update, is that these threats, they're layered, and those the big nation states, those seriously high risk ones. But the reality is that most of the information you'll be receiving is some of what you might call lower risk. But the reality is that's important to know, especially in the evolving threat landscape now, that all these threats to kind of cut out that noise need some genuine rigor and analysis in order to provide the kind of relevance and context of the organizations you use.
I think
Yeah,
building on that, you've got to start small and maybe think big over time. So, you know, I ask this question a lot when we think about core controls, but what's the question that you're trying to answer? So, for example, you might cut your teeth with threat intelligence with something very, very basic like brand monitoring. Um, is our brand being talked about in areas of the internet we'd rather it wasn't being talked about? Has a doc site, to Lee's point, some of the bigger crimeware actors like Conti, for example, have they called us out as we've got your data, ha ha ha, and in some cases encryption isn't happening now. So the first time you'll hear about it is when somebody is waving a couple of gigabytes of your data in the air. Um, Once you understand how to process that level of intelligence, you can then start to think slightly broader. To Max's point, are you worried about nation state actors? Are there particular e-crime actors that are interested in your industry sector? But I think if you try and do it the other way around and go, right, well, let's just see what the world of threats looks like to us, you won't see the wood for the trees. So I think you really have to start with a focal point and then build out from that.
yeah. I was going to ask Lee as well. Just is attribution something to talk about here, and just in terms of, do you have a good sense ever, if there's a serious attack coming your way, is there a good chance to understand who's behind it? I guess I'm asking that question because organizations would like to know, because I guess it could change their response. But yeah, just curious about whether Russian attacks are materially different to those that come from maybe China or Iran or North Korea or someone like that.
Attribution is very, very difficult. Even when at first it seems really obvious where an attack has originated from, often that's not the case. I can't necessarily talk about specifics, but I've seen attacks attributed in the media quite incorrectly. So it can be a bit of a red herring. In terms of, can you look at TTPs and come up with this notion that it's a particular nation state? Yeah, maybe to a degree, but it's a real problem definitively attributing attacks.
But the thing is, though, do you really care about attribution? So just hear me out, right? A threat is a threat is a threat. If there's a bullet with your name on it, do you really care what gun it's come from? You just want to do something with that information. Does attribution really matter to everybody?
You're absolutely right. I think for probably 99% of orgs, it doesn't matter at all. It may specifically apply to governments and particular industries at certain times, depending on the context around that. But in general, no, doesn't matter.
And it doesn't matter in terms of, if you know who's doing it, you might have a better sense of where else in the organization they might have got through to, or the information they might be interested in.
I mean, you can link it back to TTPs potentially, but again, I don't think it really matters because decent and well honed nation state actors and e-crime actors, they change their attack techniques. They may have an MO that you can kind of draw it back to, but as Lee says, one of the biggest challenges with attribution is people copy others' techniques, and you end up with. I just don't think it's that relevant. If you know that somebody is out there is trying locks on the doors, for example, they're going after open RDP ports, do something about it. The important thing to do is act on that information. If RDP is an attack vector and there's lots of people out there trying and scanning, well, I think the first thing I'd do is walk the fence and find out if you've got any of those open ports and shut them the hell down and do it quickly. Don't worry about, was it the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans. I just don't think that's relevant. And it comes back to, knowing what to do with this threat information in the context of your organization. Let the analysts worry about where it may have come from, because I just don't think it's relevant at that molecular organizational level. But I mean, to Lee's point, if you're a government agency, then yeah, clearly you're going to be interested in that. But that's a higher power. This is where our colleagues at NCSC and beyond are worrying about things like that. Not at skip level, not for any organisation.
Max, I just want to ask you about sort of issue connected with attribution, which is just how do organisations prioritise? I mean, I guess that if suddenly everybody's being hit by the same big nasty attack, then yeah, you've got a job of work to do. But is that part of the reason for doing threat intelligence, just knowing what's most likely to cause you trouble and act on that basis, or is it something else there?
Yeah, threat intelligence can certainly help organisations to really understand critical assets and their crown jewels per se. But I think as well it's important when you start developing threat intelligence and go on the journey of maturity in the space is to have a real purpose and drive and common mission within the organization before you start implementing it, to understand where your priorities lie and to know what sort of information you bringing into the organization is key in terms of fulfilling that and sort of using the capability to answer those questions that the business is asking.
I just want to build on that, if I may. Context is so vitally important. I'll give you an example. No names, no pack drill. But in my past life, we were incubating a threat intelligence capability, and the digest was going through a bit of a filtering mechanism where we could apply a little bit of business context. But for whatever reason, that triage capability didn't exist. The people who were bringing the threat intelligence together thought it was important to get that information to endpoint, get it to the consumer, but they couldn't have been more wrong, because without that context, the organisation literally flipped to DEFCON 1 because people weren't able to understand what that threat intelligence meant to their organisation. And it caused more problems than it solved. And I remember coming back from leave and getting, let's just say my ears were burning after that conversation. So I think you've touched on something really important here, which is the prerequisites for using threat intelligence well. If you can't think about who you are, what you are, and why you are, when you then take that threat intelligence and you try and put it together to that context, if you're not able to do that, I wouldn't start ingesting threat intelligence at all. And you need to get those basics right. And kind of back to you, Max. Surely this came up in the report as well. Do you agree with that? Is there anything additionally that you need to think about as prerequisites?
Yeah, definitely. I think that was one of the major changes in this updating report is organizations and the members were able to give us a lot more guidance in terms of practical considerations for developing and implementing threat intelligence, which was kind of really developed. But yeah, there's certainly key aspects and prerequisites that without developing them or understanding them, threat intelligence just reduces its value and it becomes, another a feed of information and that sort of distraction from the day-to-day of what's actually really necessary. But I think, as you kind of mentioned there, Paul, a bit, it's about educating not only the users in terms of the analysts and the producers of intelligence, but also making it very clear with different functions and aspects of the business that will be consuming it so they're aware of who these people are that are producing it and what mechanisms are in place to ensure that they're receiving the correct information, which is actually valuable in terms of it sort of improving their role and their decision making processes.
Yeah, I think as well, there's another aspect of this I suspect ISF members, CISOs, etc., have to contend with, and that's pressure from upwards as well. Just chief execs and people like that saying, "Oh, seeing this on the news, are we protected?" And I guess you can wave your threat intelligence at them to stop that. But a question for Lee, I suppose, because as a hack, used to write about the sexiest, biggest, nastiest threats out there. But I just wonder if they were the ones that we should have been worrying about. Just, from your point of view, you mentioned the media already, Lee, but just did they get it wrong a lot of the times, that they do concentrate on the sexy stuff rather than the stuff that's actually doing the damage?
Yeah, so and I totally understand why, but I think the media really does love a nation state attack. But they're probably not the most serious threats that organizations face. It is still very much ransomware. That is the biggest issue by far that I've seen through threat intelligence, especially with the exfiltration and ransom of the actual data itself. Nation state attacks, very contextual. I mean, right now, with what's going on in Ukraine, sure, there's some definite risks there to certain organizations, but in general, it's crimeware groups that companies and members should be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, certainly as a journalist, it was, if there was a nation state mentioned in some marketing material that came our way from security companies who bombarded me with a lot of stuff, then yeah, it would pique my interest more than some of the other stuff, which, rightly or wrongly, but yeah, it was because it was a good story. But equally, I did find it was very frustrating to write those stories because it was hard to get any detail at all, because a lot of organizations were very reluctant to talk about specifics because they probably did business in some of those countries or just had other relationships that they didn't want to jeopardize. But I just take on that question of pressure from the top up. I don't know if, Paul, you have had that as a CISO, just someone knocking on your door saying we need to worry about this, and whether threat intelligence would help with that, or is it a case of, well, a well-run information security function wouldn't be surprised at those kinds of questions?
Oh, no, all the time. I was smiling away hearing Lee's comments there, because I completely agree with that. The first thing I would say is absolutely agree. One of the EDR vendors out there recently released a study that said 75% of the attacks that they've seen and observed have been e-crime. 24% of those are nation states. 1% of that is hacktivism. And of the 24% that's nation states, 20 to 30% of that, they really struggle with attribution. So yeah, I mean, it's although it's sexy, if I can use that word in context, it's not necessarily hugely relevant. With regard to your last point, it's actually become quite an interesting conversational gambit. Now, it's a little bit cat and mouse, but when something breaks in the media, and whether they've got that right or got that wrong, it starts a bit of a timer in my head. It's a little bit of an arms race, in that I want to have an answer in the context of my organization that I can put in front of the board before the question comes down from the board. And it's happened a lot over the last 2 or 3 years. And it's actually built a little bit of confidence. So, I got quite a good rapport with, one of my recent CEOs, because he dropped me an email going, what's your take on that? I can go straight back with an answer. Or in other cases, when I was really good, I was preemptive, just to say, look, just before you ask the question, this is what it means to us, and this is what we're doing about it. Builds the confidence, gives you an opportunity to have the conversation, and that individual became a great advocate for the security program, and was particularly interested in our future gazing and our use of threat intelligence. And it was actually me and my team that were kind of reining that back, going, we're only going to do this at scale when we're ready. So yeah, really good point. So you can turn it into an opportunity, but it can't be hugely obsessive. And yeah, I mean, the media loves a sensationalist story. Half the battle sometimes is debunking the myths that come with that.
Yeah, certainly was, as a journalist, that was a bit of my
Yeah,
job
your
as well,
fault,
though.
Mark.
I'm not a journalist anymore, so I let other people carry the can for that. But yeah, I think that's interesting, just because I guess threat intelligence, Max, your views on this, it can become a real distraction, I guess, as well. You can endlessly chase these things, because if you take a good look at your organization, you're probably vulnerable in a lot of different ways, but threat intelligence could lead you down lots of your own rabbit holes, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you have to definitely be careful about your appetite for sort of viewing and trying to really take your assessment of threat intelligence too far down a level, because you can certainly start to develop some FUD around it and really kind of scare and scaremonger a little bit in terms of just the scale of everything now, because the world we live in, with the amount of information and the flows that you could if you're checking your feed, is just absurd. So there definitely needs to be protocols around that and processes.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of danger out there. But
Mhm.
equally, I think there's some things that just hang around forever as well. Just one thing I perennially followed and still keep a sort of bit of an eye on is Conficker, which was around for years and years and years, but was what, a decade old, maybe more now. And that lurks in the internet. It self-replicates and just keeps popping up here, there, and everywhere. And I think in that background noise of the internet, it's still there.
I am having
It's,
flashbacks. In another time and
Sorry.
another place, we'll talk about my encounter with Conficker 10 years ago, and just how debilitating and mind bending it was to respond to something that moves so quickly. It's a hell of a story. But thanks for bringing that back up. Really appreciate that. Gonna go and have a little
Yeah.
lie down now.
Yeah, well, we'll be done soon, so you can go into a darkened room and recover. Final thing I wanted to talk about is I think threat intelligence is being put into 27001. So is there a danger here that a lot of organisations are just going to say, "Oh, quick, we need to get some of that," and it is going to be done for those wrong reasons? But what kind of damage can it do, Lee? I mean, or Paul or Max? Just curious if it's a real distraction, but you kind of need to tick that box. Where does it leave you?
I've
Yeah, I
got a
think
view
the
on this, but I'll
problem.
let Lee go first.
I think the problem with rushing into threat intelligence is the fact that, as other people have already said, it's noise, and you've got to have a clear plan of what you're going to do with it to make it a benefit rather than a hindrance. So, with it being mandated in 27001, that's a potential issue, and it needs to be planned in very well from the beginning.
I completely agree with that. A little bit of a soapbox rant for me, which is rare. I know, me having a rant about something, but as Mark rightly says, the threat intelligence consideration has found its way into the 27002 update, which means it will ultimately find itself into the Annex A controls of 27001. And we come to the murky world of what I call the illusion of compliance. So, will organisations feel that they need to throw a bit of money at an agency to deliver a threat intelligence capability to tick a regulatory or compliance box? I would strongly recommend that organisations think very, very hard about doing that. Threat intelligence is a useful capability, but it has to be a build on prerequisites of maturity and foundational controls and processes that need to exist in an organization. Otherwise, it's a solution looking for a problem. And I wouldn't want to be the CISO who finds their organization dealing with an extinction level attack and in the post-mortem realized that the indicators of that potential compromise and those early warnings were in front of his or her nose all the time, but they lack the capacity to do anything useful with that. That to me would be a worst case scenario. So you need to think about and look at Max's comments in the report, because he's done a great job in really calling this out. Think about the prerequisites. Think about what it is you're trying to do with threat intelligence. Start slow, build it up gradually, win hearts and minds, and make sure it's closed loop. Again, another thing that Max goes into some detail on the report is ask the stakeholders whether you're answering the right questions. And if you're not, refine what you're collecting, refine how you contextualize that information and turn it into something actionable and insightful, and then ask them again. Please don't go out and buy these services just because the model and the framework says you have to buy it. It's just not the right approach. It really, really isn't. I know, Max, look, I've instilled the virtues of your report there. You spent a lot of time on this. Is there anything that you would add to that?
Yeah, no, I think you summarized it well there. But from my side, I think the concern would be, my feeling from the original report in 2017 was that organizations obviously, were a bit amiss with what threat intelligence was and what it meant and how to really use it. But at that time, it was, obviously it's an expensive capability to purchase and begin the journey. So these organizations had the capacity to sort of absorb the impacts of that and any sort of, negatives that it was producing. Whereas I think if it goes into a kind of a compliance framework going forward, it's going to be organizations maybe, reverting back to that quick buy, take it off the shelf and try and stick it in somewhere, but might not necessarily have the same, funding levels and capacity to really, accept that in the way that these organizations were in back in 2017. So I kind of fear that, is it going to be taking a step back maybe from those who have a clearly defined structure?
Yeah, because I can imagine if someone switches it on, they'll suddenly almost be overwhelmed. Like you say, there's a lot out there, and as Lee said, there's a lot of noise as well. And just if you're not understanding why you're getting that and what you're going to do with it, and the context that fits in, etc., then yeah, it's going to be difficult to make proper use of it. And as Paul says as well, it could be in the wrong place at the right time by just realizing, yeah, it was there all the time, but you didn't have the ability to do with it, and yeah, that probably would not go well.
I think Max makes a good point, though, that if you go back to when we wrote the first report in 2017, I think it was, Max, you could have considered and posed that threat intelligence was a luxury item. And I think that's fair. I think that's a fair shout. The world has moved on in terms of threat velocity. How dynamic the threat landscape is. I mean, that sounds like a cliche, but every hour of every day is slightly different in terms of what you need to worry about. Threat intelligence is bordering on becoming a commodity, but it's a commodity that you have to think really hard about bringing into your organization. And again, and Lee, I don't know whether it might be a bit unfair to ask you this question, but in terms of the run maintain cost of threat intelligence, are we seeing those costs coming down, or is it still quite an expensive practice to put into organizations? I mean, it certainly wasn't and hasn't been cheap when I brought it in, but is it becoming cheaper? Is the cost of implementation run maintain coming down?
Based on my experiences, I'd say quite the opposite. It's becoming more expensive.
Wow,
It requires more and more analysts and researchers. And there's just going back to the point earlier about the noise, there's more and more intelligence available now as well.
Is that literally what it comes down to? You've just got way too many signals to process now, and actually, I mean, that kind of ties back to Threat Horizon 2024, Mark. When we talked about what the total information and data capital of the planet by 2025. I think IDC posed the number, which sounded ludicrous when they first put it out, but actually, we're absolutely tracking to those sorts of volumes. So. Yeah, I mean, you need an army to do this, right? So what about advances in threat intelligence? Does artificial intelligence and machine learning play a part in getting this right? Is that something that we need to be thinking about as well? Or does that just make it even more expensive for people to implement?
For what I saw, AI and ML are very much in their infancy in threat intelligence. There's some way to go with that yet. It still requires the human element by and large.
I think we're basically supporting our own argument here in that the best way to implement threat intelligence is start small and grow as you can, and whether the economies of scale are there or not, I really don't know. Everybody's slightly different, but just rushing out to just stick this on your organization like a plaster on a wound, I just think is absolutely the wrong approach. So just to reiterate my point, please don't do that.
No, indeed. If there's one big takeaway from this, it's make it actionable, understand your context, I guess, and just don't bolt it on for the sake of it. Thank you, everybody, for taking part. This is a really great discussion, and thanks everyone for listening. You can find more podcasts on the ISF podcast channel or at securityforum.org, where you can also learn more about ISF research tools and guidance.